On Boxing Day, 1900, a man named Joseph Mor climbed 160 stone steps up the side of a cliff on one of the most remote islands in the North Atlantic. He was alone. The relief ship behind him had fired rockets, sounded its horn, raised its flag. No response from the island. Not a single sign of life. Mor reached the top. The compound gate was closed. The main door was shut. He pushed it open. The clock on the wall had stopped. The beds were unmade. The fire was cold, dead for days. There were supposed to be 3 men living in this lighthouse. 3 experienced keepers, stationed here for a routine 2-week rotation. Mor searched every room, climbed every staircase, checked every corner of the island. There was no one. No bodies, no blood, no note, no goodbye. 3 men had vanished from a rock in the middle of the ocean. And to this day, no one can explain how. This is the Flannan Isles Lighthouse mystery. It is one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in modern history. You may have heard this story before. There is a famous version that involves terrified logbook entries, men weeping and praying as a storm closed in around them. If you know that version, I need you to forget it, because almost none of it is true. The real story is stranger, and the detail that actually explains what happened is something that almost nobody talks about. The Flannan Isles are a small chain of uninhabited rocks about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. The largest island is called Eilean Mor. It is barely half a mile across. For centuries, local shepherds would bring their sheep to graze on the Flannan Isles. The grass was rich and the animals thrived there, but no shepherd would ever stay overnight. The islands had a reputation. Locals spoke of spirits, of a presence they could not explain. Pilgrims who visited the ancient chapel of St. Flannan on the island followed strict rituals. They removed their hats the moment they stepped ashore. They walked in circles, always clockwise. They never spoke the word island while they were there. In 1895, the Northern Lighthouse Board began construction of a lighthouse on Eilean Mor. Every piece of building material had to be hauled up 45-meter cliffs directly from boats. The lighthouse took 4 years to build. It cost nearly £4,000, which today would be over $500,000. It was first lit on the 7th of December, 1899. 1 year and 8 days later, 3 men would disappear from it. The lighthouse operated on a rotation system. 4 keepers were assigned to the station. 3 worked on the island at any given time, while the 4th rested on the mainland at the shore station in Brescleet on the Isle of Lewis. The 3 men on duty in December 1900 were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. James Ducat was the principal keeper. He was 44 years old, married to a woman named Mary, and the father of 4 children. Louisa was 16, Robert was 13, Annabella was 9. Arthur was 6. Ducat had served the Northern Lighthouse Board for 22 years. He was experienced, steady, and trusted enough to be placed in charge of one of the most remote and dangerous postings in Britain. Thomas Marshall was the 2nd assistant. He was younger, unmarried, and had no children. He was relatively new in his role and had already been fined 5 shillings for losing equipment in a previous storm. That detail will matter later. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper. He was filling in for the regular first assistant, William Ross, who was on sick leave. MacArthur was married with 2 children. He was also, by all accounts, a man with a temper. Former colleagues described him as volatile, quick to argue, quick to use his fists. On the 7th of December 1900, the superintendent of lighthouses, Robert Muirhead, visited the island for a routine inspection. He found everything in working order. The light was functioning. The keepers were performing their duties. Muirhead spoke with Ducat about the thick sea mist that often blanketed the island. Everything appeared normal. Muirhead left, and that was the last time anyone saw the 3 keepers alive. 8 days later, on the night of December 15, the transatlantic steamer Arctur was making its way from Philadelphia to Leith, Scotland. As it passed the Flannan Isles around midnight, the crew noticed something unusual. The lighthouse was dark. The captain logged it but continued on. When the Arctur docked in Leith on December 18, the crew reported the dead light to the harbour authorities. But through a series of miscommunications, the report was slow to reach the Northern Lighthouse Board. Meanwhile, a man named Roderick Mackenzie had been watching from the mainland. Mackenzie was a gamekeeper paid £8 a year to observe the Flannan Isles Lighthouse from Gallon Head, 18 miles away. Each night, he was supposed to note whether the light was visible, but Mackenzie later told investigators that poor weather had made it impossible for him to see the lighthouse for several days around mid-December. The relief vessel Hesperus was supposed to arrive at the island on December 20. Bad weather delayed it for 6 days. It finally reached Eilean Mor on the afternoon of December 26. As the Hesperus approached the island, the crew noticed the first signs that something was wrong. There was no flag on the flagpole. This was standard protocol. When the relief ship arrived, the keepers on duty would raise a flag to signal they were ready for the exchange. No flag. Captain James Harvey sounded the ship's horn. No response. He fired a signal rocket into the sky. Nothing. Joseph Mor, the fourth keeper who had been resting on the mainland, was lowered into a small boat and rowed to the east landing. He climbed the 160 steps alone. The entrance gate to the compound was closed. The main door was shut. Mor pushed it open and stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. A meal had been set, but parts of it were untouched. A chair lay overturned. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the grate was stone cold and had clearly not been lit for days. Mor moved through the building. The lamps had been cleaned and refilled, ready for the evening light. The last routine work appeared to have been completed on the morning of December 15. Everything was in order, except for one critical detail. In the hallway, 3 sets of oilskins normally hung on hooks by the door. Oilskins were heavy waterproof coats, essential for going outside in a storm. 2 of the hooks were empty, but one coat, the one belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging there. 2 men had dressed for the weather. One had not. Mor searched every room. He climbed to the top of the tower. He walked the perimeter of the island. He found nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no sign of struggle. 3 men were simply gone. Mor returned to the landing and signaled the Hesperus. Captain Harvey immediately sent a telegram. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Mor and 3 volunteer seamen stayed on the island to keep the light running. 3 days later, on December 29, Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrived to conduct an official investigation. Muirhead knew all 3 missing men personally. He had recruited them himself. He began by examining the island. The east landing, where Mor had come ashore, was undamaged, but the west landing was a different story entirely. The west side of Eilean Mor takes the full force of the Atlantic. Waves there do not behave the way waves behave on a normal coastline. The cliffs are steep and exposed, and the ocean funnels between the rocks in ways that create enormous, unpredictable surges of water. What Muirhead found on the west landing was devastation. A supply box that had been secured in a crevice over 30 meters above sea level had been smashed open, its contents scattered. Iron railings along the path were bent and twisted. The iron railway used to haul supplies up the cliff had been ripped out of its concrete foundations, and a boulder, estimated to weigh more than a ton, had been displaced from its position high above the waterline. These were not the marks of a normal storm. Something extraordinary had hit the west side of the island. Muirhead checked the keeper's log. The last full entries were for December 13. But the slate, which keepers used to jot down readings before transferring them to the log, had been filled in through the morning of December 15. Barometer readings, wind readings, the time the light was extinguished at dawn, all recorded, all routine. Whatever happened, it happened on the afternoon of December 15, after the morning's work was done. Muirhead turned his attention to the oilskins. He confirmed that the coat left hanging belonged to MacArthur. This is the detail that drives every theory about what happened. 2 men, Ducat and Marshall, put on their waterproof gear before going outside. Standard procedure. You do not go out on Eilean Mor in December without protection. But MacArthur did not dress. His coat was still on its hook. His boots were still inside. There is only one reason you leave a lighthouse in the middle of a North Atlantic winter without your coat. You leave in a hurry. You leave because something has happened that is more urgent than getting dressed. Muirhead also noted a critical protocol. Lighthouse regulations strictly required at least one keeper to remain in the lighthouse at all times. One man always had to stay behind to tend the light. The fact that all three were gone meant that either the rules were broken deliberately, or something happened that forced the third man out. Now here is where the most famous version of this story collapses. For over a century, books and documentaries have repeated the same chilling account. The story goes like this. In the days before the disappearance, Thomas Marshall wrote increasingly desperate entries in the logbook. He described a storm worse than anything he had ever experienced. He wrote that Ducat, the experienced principal keeper, had become unusually quiet. He wrote that MacArthur, the tough former soldier, had been found crying. The final entry, supposedly dated December 15, read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." It is a haunting account. It has been repeated in hundreds of articles, in documentaries, and even in films. And none of it is real. The journalist Mike Dash, writing for the Fortean Times, traced the origin of these entries and could find no evidence that they ever existed. The logbook entries were almost certainly invented years after the disappearance and then repeated so often that they became accepted as fact. This is not uncommon in mystery stories. The Mary Celeste, another famous disappearance, was also distorted by a fictional account. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a short story about it that introduced details like a half-eaten meal and warm tea on the table. None of those details were real either, but they entered the public imagination and stayed there. The same thing happened with the Flannan Isles. A poet named Wilfrid Wilson Gibson published a ballad in 1912 that described the scene with theatrical detail. An overturned chair, an untouched meal on the table. These images were poetry, not fact, but they stuck. Strip away the fiction, and what you are left with is more unsettling, not less, because the real evidence does not point to a dramatic climax. It points to something ordinary that went wrong in a way that could not be recovered from. Muirhead's official conclusion was straightforward. He believed that Marshall and Ducat had gone to the West Landing to check on the supply equipment after the recent storm. Marshall had a financial incentive. He had already been fined for losing gear in a previous storm and would have been anxious to secure the ropes and boxes before they were lost again. While the two men were working near the cliff edge, an unexpectedly large wave, what sailors call a rogue wave, surged up the face of the rock. On a cliff 30 meters high, this sounds impossible. But the physical evidence said otherwise. A boulder weighing over a ton had been moved. Iron railings had been bent. The railway had been ripped from concrete. The phenomenon is well documented. In exposed coastal locations, ocean swells can combine in unpredictable ways, creating waves of extraordinary height that arrive with no warning. In Australia, they are called king waves. Fishermen have been dragged off rocks over 100 feet above sea level by waves that appear out of calm seas. Muirhead believes such a wave caught Marshall and Ducat while they worked at the West Landing. When they did not return, MacArthur, who had been keeping watch inside the lighthouse, went out to look for them. He left without his coat, without his boots. He left in a hurry, which means he either saw something or heard something that overrode every instinct to protect himself. MacArthur would have climbed down to the West Landing, and if another wave came, or if the first wave was still surging, he would have been taken too. 3 men, 3 waves. Or perhaps just one wave, and 3 decisions made in seconds that could not be undone. There is a second theory that surfaces less often because it is darker and harder to prove. Donald MacArthur was, by all available accounts, a difficult man. He was described as volatile, confrontational. In a posting where 3 men lived in close quarters on a tiny island with no way off for 2 weeks at a time, temperament matters enormously. Some historians have speculated that a conflict broke out. Perhaps MacArthur argued with one or both of the other keepers. Perhaps a physical confrontation occurred near the cliff edge on the West Landing, and all 3 men fell. Or perhaps something worse happened. Perhaps MacArthur harmed the other two men and then, overwhelmed by what he had done, threw himself from the cliff. There is no evidence for this theory, but the absence of evidence is exactly the problem. There is no evidence for any theory. The ocean takes its secrets and keeps them. What we do know is that 3 men were stationed on an island smaller than a city block, with no boat, no radio, and no way to call for help. They had only each other. And whatever happened to them happened fast enough that the 3rd man did not stop to put on his coat. Joseph Mor stayed on Eilean Mor after the disappearance. He and 3 volunteers kept the light burning until permanent replacements could be arranged. Think about that for a moment. Mor had just discovered that 3 of his colleagues had vanished from the very building where he now had to sleep, eat, and work. Alone, on an island that had terrified locals for centuries, he tended the light anyway. The bodies of James Ducar, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. Their deaths were officially recorded as probably drowning. Ducar was survived by his wife Mary and 4 children. Marshall left behind a father, a brother, and a sister. MacArthur left a wife and 2 children. The disappearance tarnished the Lighthouse's reputation for decades. The Northern Lighthouse Board struggled to find keepers willing to serve there. Newspapers across Britain and beyond ran wild with theories. Sea serpents, ghost ships, foreign spies, a phantom they called the Phantom of the 7 Hunters. None of those theories hold up, but neither does any single rational explanation account for every detail. The stopped clock, the missing oilskins, the one coat still on its hook. Here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you think MacArthur ran out to save them? Or do you think something else happened on that rock? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, the dark, the strange, the stories that refuse to give you a clean answer, subscribe to Dark Histories. The next one is darker than this.